All right, welcome back to the next episode in our look at Extra History's The Inca Empire. This time we're taking a look at their episode, The Earthshaker. So let's go ahead and dive right back in. There's a few things that we're going to have to eventually discuss with it, I'm sure. The first episode I found fascinating, and I also think that it's a very good kind of delve into the realities and the difficulties of finding solid and real history associated with a lot of these pre-Columbian societies that sadly lost so much of their history in the disease outbreaks that occur after the arrival of the Europeans and in the conquests that occur throughout that period.
Cusco, 1438. The emperor, called Sapa Inca, son of the sun god Inti, has returned to the capital. But he is afraid. Waiting for him is his son, Inca Yupanqui. 20 years before, an army had marched on Cusco, and in response, the emperor fled to a mountain fortress with his chosen heir. But the emperor also left Yupanqui, his third son, to hopelessly defend the city. Yet the sun god saw Yupanqui's bravery and intervened. It was said that even the stones themselves rose up to fight on the prince's behalf. But with the enemy routed, the emperor did not return, afraid of his son's new power. So for 20 years, Yupanqui rebuilt Cusco in the emperor's absence as his father sent assassins to kill his usurping child. But now, the emperor has returned, and in doing so, he formally hands over his position to his son and grants him a new name, Pachacuti, the Earthshaker.
All right, so that's a fascinating intro as to how he earns that title. And you'll notice this throughout a lot of not just American mythology and backgrounds, but if you go back to the old world, there's a lot of stories like this where they become mythologized into stories of miraculous victory or tales. But specifically, this is a story as to how he's going to gain that title and how he's going to become the head of the Incan Empire. This is something that we also see a lot in the old world. The idea of the leader being a child or an embodiment of a god. In this case, he would be the grandson of the sun god in this story. Just like in a lot of Egyptian periods, the pharaoh would be a version of Horus or Ra. And we see that be kind of a through line for a lot of cultures throughout time. And it maintains, even as European societies kind of move away from the mythologization of origins, they still maintain throughout like the 1600s and into the 1700s this idea of divine right, where God gives them the right and the privilege to rule. So there's a lot to kind of parse out and think about. It's one of the reasons why there's theories that say the Greek gods originated as very powerful Mycenaean things, because a lot of different cultures have put divinity into their leadership. And I do like this idea of the Earthshaker being a direct tie back to his kind of origin story, where the rocks step up and help fight and defend Cusco. So that's a very cool origin for that title.
Comcast Business Advanced.
Of course, the second that is never gotta be convenient, you know what I mean? But, yeah, no, the Incan Empire is something that I'm very excited to be looking at. I've actually been discussing with, at this point, one commenter, Madi, but I think this could be a good jump-off point for a lot of conversations.
Pachacuti turned out to be a pretty good name for this ninth ruler of the Inca, because while the name did mean Earthshaker, it was also a philosophical concept. In Quechua, the Inca's primary language, a Pachacuti was a historic event, a cataclysm that overturned space and time, remaking the world. It was a good title for the man who had forged the kingdom of Cusco into an empire. Now, Cusco was likely expansionist before Pachacuti, and they'd probably been laying the groundwork for empire building in the previous 2 centuries of the kingdom's ascendancy. Their agricultural terraces were productive enough to support large populations, and they had a system for freeze-drying potatoes and llama meat to make long-lasting military rations. In fact, the word jerky comes from the Quechua term for dried meat. On top of all that, their system of roads and agricultural storehouses increased the range of their reach, and their labor system allowed them to call up large numbers of troops. See, the Incan economy didn't use money or commerce of any kind. Instead, the state took its tax in labor.
And you'll notice that with a lot of ancient civilizations. Actually, a lot of this, you could see parallels. If you want to have a successful empire, you need to have the foundation built ahead of time. An individual taking charge and then immediately just rushing out isn't going to work. Alexander the Great builds his massive empire on the backs of his father Philip, who had invaded Greece. And Philip invades Greece based off of the work that his father had done. Temujin, Genghis Khan, he basically looks at the way that the Mongols had already been battling it out with China and its neighbors and brought it to its logical conclusion. He needs a little bit less of the empire building foundation because of the fact that they're nomadic and they kind of move with their cities. But if you're going to be a sedimentary group and still expand, you need long-lasting rations. You need dedicated and structured military forces. Otherwise, things are going to become a little bit chaotic. But yeah, this is a very common reality where individuals would pay into the government through labor. That's how much of the Great Wall is built in China. That's believed to be, at least in part, how a number of the great monuments in Egypt are constructed. So this is a very common thing, especially before common and easy access to money and coinage. In Japan, they don't use money and coinage either for a certain period. We don't have time to get into it. Actually, I think we are just going to move on. But needless to say, this is a fairly common reality.
During the agricultural off-season, peasants in Inca lands would be drafted for infrastructure construction, building roads, temples, or agricultural terraces, or perhaps doing metalwork on gold or weapons if it was a local specialty. And in return, they would be issued anything they needed from government storehouses. But labor service could also mean marshaling for war. When the Sapa Inca called up his army, the local chief or Inca representative would organize a labor draft. Then the people, few of them professional warriors, would show up armed in the traditional ethnic clothing and carrying whatever weapons they favored. Some of these far-ranging societies were slingers, others spearmen, some Amazonian archers with poison-tipped arrows, and others shock troops from the fiercest societies the Inca had conquered. Others still, the least military talented, essentially served as cannon fodder. And when Pachacuti took the throne of Cusco, the first thing he did was put out the call to muster for war.
So that's something else that's specific. You've got to realize that before really the 1700s, the idea of a standing professional military is very rare, if ever there. The cost is typically too high, especially to manufacture and arm them. That's why most professional militaries had been smaller throughout time. Now, there are some big examples where that's not true. Chinese dynasties and the Romans, of course, maintained professional militaries to a pretty high degree. But you'll notice that even, say, the Byzantines, who are the successors, or the continuation of the Roman Empire after the West falls, they become more and more and more heavily reliant on mercenaries and basic kind of unprepared troops. So while it does sound kind of crazy, like, wow, they're going to be going out there and doing this without proper equipment, without proper weapons, without anything else, unless they supply them, that's a fairly common reality globally. Now, that's going to be also an issue when the Spanish arrive, because the Spanish, unlike a lot of groups, actually does have a professional military at this point, because they have been fighting for centuries to retake Iberia following the Muslim conquests back before the year 1000. So by this point, the conquistadors that arrive typically have a lot of experience in combat and preparation and armor and equipment. So that's going to be an issue. That's going to be the last episode, I believe. But now we are on that expansionist path where they are trying to grow the kingdom into a massive empire.
Because not only did he need to solidify his power, but he also dreamed of conquering all of the Andes. Pachacuti's father had extended Inca territory beyond Cusco, and that meant Pachacuti was already one step ahead of the kingdom's rivals. Outside the walls of his capital, there was no group large or cohesive enough to really rival him.
Oh, that's something else I wanted to mention, actually. The fact that you'll notice there's a variety of different groups that are being mustered for war. That is indicative of a kingdom or an empire that is willing to integrate new groups into the empire proper and make them a more real part of it. Plenty of times throughout history, kingdoms have conquered neighbors and then been oppressive or directly anti that group. That is not a recipe for peace. That's not a recipe for cooperation. Whereas if you are willing to go in and then integrate that region directly into the empire, still use them in war, still build improvements in their region, still support them with government supplies, that region's more likely to support and back them. And like they're pointing out here, there's no group big enough to really push back. Even the ones that aren't as cohesive. They aren't actually able to call up the same number of men, the same amount of equipment, the same amount of food and supplies. Logistics wins wars. And if you cannot properly maintain your logistics, you will fall apart. And that's something that the road systems and the massive networks that the Incans are going to create in the Andes is going to be so important to their long-term success.
The Andes being nothing but warring ethnic groups, too splintered to resist a large power.
Alright.
Fact, local societies were so outmatched by Cusco that some historians argue that Pachacuti's miraculous defense might be a myth, invented or heavily embellished in order to legitimize his coup. In this climate...
Now, of course, some of that is certainly myth, the idea of like the rock standing and fighting. But a lot of leaders throughout history have used the idea of the mythologized origin to support their rule and support their efforts.
Of fractured powers and small groups, even Cusco's modest territorial holdings, just a few population centers dominated, proved impossible to resist, whether diplomatically or militarily. Pachacuti drove south, taking mountain forts and wresting control away from local tribes. And he took their leaders back to Cusco, where he would lay them down in a line and walk on their heads to show dominance before beheading them. Whew, dominance
Brutal.
combo. Some he flayed, stuffing their empty skins with ashes. And with each conquered territory, he gained more laborers for his roads and more soldiers for his armies.
Yep. And that's the brutality, especially of kind of pre-modern warfare. Modern warfare is still incredibly brutal. But a lot of groups were very keen to remove any theoretical rivals in the new conquests. And that is a pretty powerful statement that's being made to show dominance and then remove their ability to fight back by killing them, by beheading them.
But he didn't fight everyone. Indeed, if he had, his conquests would have never happened so quickly.
Yep.
For the Inca, military force was a last resort. And initially, they would send ambassadors with gifts and offers of marriage, essentially promising that, apart from the labor tax, nothing would change in local government, culture, or society. In return, the society would get access to Inca roads and storehouses. Oh, and as an added bonus, they wouldn't be destroyed. Hooray! If gifts and alliances failed, however, then the Inca would threaten military force. And considering they could field armies of over 100,000 warriors, this was often pretty persuasive.
Yeah.
Especially when they used the mountainous terrain to appear without warning.
And that's something that makes it so difficult throughout this. Now, first off, diplomacy is a necessity in kind of any successful empire building. Let's go to the cons. The reason why the cons are able to build such a massive and powerful empire so quickly out of Mongolia is not direct, pure military acumen. It is a big part, do not get me wrong, but they would often arrive in a city and they would give them two options. Submit, pay a tithe to us, give us a tax for now kind of protecting, it's a protection racket effectively, your kingdom. You tell us no, we are going to burn your city to the ground. That's what happens in Baghdad, for instance. Kaffa. They arrive and they say, hey, hand over the keys, we're in charge, or we will besiege your city. That's what ends up happening. They besiege the city. Many other places throughout the region just submitted. It's not an easy choice, but if you're hearing off in the distance that this massive force is conquering territory for territory, brutally just obliterating the rivals, it's much more likely that you're going to go, okay, I'm in. I will work with you. This is a similar tactic to what the Aztecs do. And this is also very similar to the idea of vassalage in the feudal period, where kings and queens, for the protection of the larger whole, would offer titles and roles inside of their government, basically bringing in more and more duchies and counties to the larger piece. All that makes sense. And also the Andes themselves, that geography makes it hard to get real sight lines. It's pretty easy for a well put together, experienced group to move without being seen. And this happens in a lot of different regions. You'll see terrain is always pivotal in any kind of conflict. The Vietnamese use the jungle in the Vietnam War to protect themselves, hide and raid against U.S. and South Vietnamese forces. We see this in Korea. After the lines kind of solidify after the Chinese counterattack against the UN, and the UN gets another counterattack back up close to the parallel, they dig in. they use those mountains to their advantage and make it effectively impossible to invade the rest of the way without just immense casualties and clearing all these bunkers. And then in fighting in Afghanistan and, well, not so much Afghanistan, but fighting in Iraq, we see the use of air power become less efficient during sandstorms or major weather events. So terrain and climate are always going to be important and impactful to a military endeavor.
Many a local noble, brave in his stone palace, would quickly capitulate once he saw an Inca army suddenly appear outside his walls, banging drums stretched with the skin of defeated enemies, and playing flutes made from human bone. Only in a minority of cases did the Inca have to actually fight. When he reached modern
Intimidation is a very powerful tool when it comes to expansion, or when it comes to victory. There's little that's more intimidating than an army of 100,000 being led by people playing instruments made out of their former enemies. It's pretty terrifying.
Bolivia, Pachacuti deemed it far enough and returned to the capital. But for his next expedition, he sent his brother north into the Andes in a bid to conquer all the way to the coast. This move gave the burgeoning Inca state access to the sea and solidified the transformation of Inca power. Pachacuti no longer ruled a kingdom. The Earthshaker now had his empire.
Yep.
But war is dangerous for a ruler. Good rulers delegate, but that sometimes meant you delegate away your glory. And that was especially not ideal in a state like the Incas, where there was no specific grounds for succession, and primogeniture didn't hold sway. Theoretically, any male relative could succeed Pachacuti. A son, an uncle, or a brother. Maybe one who'd gained a reputation as a conqueror, for instance.
I don't like writing essays, but...
I'm seeing where they're going with this, and it makes a lot of sense. We've seen that throughout history a lot, too. The idea of the family member who gains glory out in the world and ends up usurping their family.
On the northern expedition's glorious return to Cusco, Pachacuti charged his brother and all the generals with treason over a troop uprising and executed them. There, that fixed it. This would actually set a pattern. If you were a general in the Inca Empire, you wanted to be successful, sure, just not too successful, especially if you were related to the Sapa Inca. Generals that won stunning victories almost always got beheaded upon returning to Cusco, because the Sapa Inca was the child of the sun, and you do not outshine the sun. Pachacuti learned a valuable lesson. If you're going to delegate to someone, make sure you're comfortable with them getting the credit. So as a result, he sent his son and chosen heir, Tupac Inca Yupanqui, whose name, I kid you not, is sometimes pronounced Tupac, and I ain't mad at you, on a new northern expedition.
Oh, that caught me off guard, and I do appreciate it. And that's something else that is very smart to do. Pick who you want to be in charge after you're gone, and make sure that they get the credit. Make sure that they are the ones who are building up their fame and their kind of resume as a right to rule the empire.
Now, this was sort of a war internship, a way to help him gain experience while burnishing his ruler resume. Zoe, you got one of those, right? The gambit worked spectacularly. Pachacuti could rule the center, while his son fought the brutal military campaigns on the coast in modern Ecuador and head the first forays east into the Amazon. These grinding campaigns sharpened Tupac Inca into a fierce, ruthless warrior, one willing to dam a settlement's water supply to force surrender. He also learned how to maximize his military force, rotating his Andean troops back into the mountains periodically so they could recover from the unfamiliar coastal and jungle environments. Still,
So he's thinking ahead. He's building up a plan. He's got a process in mind. And that's something that's you'll find in the most successful leaders throughout time. They know that an army cannot march eternally into combat. They need moments of respite. They need moments of recovery. And being able to rotate the troops back and forth maintains a decent military size and prevents exhaustion and the mistakes that come with, or the resentments that come with, constant pushing conquest.
Inca had difficulty pushing into the hostile jungles of the Amazon, an effort Tupa Inca eventually had to abandon in order to crush a rebellion. With his son in the
Yeah, the Amazon is not surprising that that's where they faced issues. It is such an immense and almost impassable region. The jungle is so thick overall, with the trees, the vines, not to mention the animal variety is itself incredibly dangerous. The environment at that point is just as much, if not more, dangerous than the people that are living inside of it. And that's going to make it very hard to not just conquer. Like, it'd be fine if they were to go in and conquer a couple of villages, but could they maintain that hold? And the answer is probably not long term. There's a reason why that region is still sparsely populated. If you look at a population map of Brazil, which holds most of the Amazon rainforest, you'll notice that the vast majority of the population lives on the east coast, not inland. It's because the jungle is so dense, it is so difficult to work with.
field. Pachacuti could manage the empire's building program, personally sculpting a model of his new capital from clay. And he continued improving Cusco, augmenting it to carry water to the city through underground channels. He raised forts in the hills and built lavish royal residences, supposedly including Machu Picchu, though granted that is heavily disputed. But he did erect palaces, hospitals, and temples while laying roads to his new conquests. But Pachacuti's greatest work was to rebuild the Golden Courtyard, a temple dedicated to the sun god Inti. In Inca religion, gold was considered the sweat of the sun, and silver the tears of the moon. So he covered the walls of the courtyard sun chamber with gold, and the walls of the moon chamber with silver.
And this is going to become a major problem when the Spanish arrive, because what are the Spanish looking for when they arrive? They're looking for, and I'm going to use the classic 3 G's here: God, the ability to convert and Christianize others; glory, the ability to conquer large-scale empires or formidable foes to gain their own fame and their own popularity so they can become powerful within the Spanish hierarchy; and gold, the riches of the New World. The Aztecs had a lot of riches. Now the Inca have a lot of riches. And when Pizarro is going to arrive, he's going to see these chambers, and he is going to make horrific things happen to get that gold and silver.
And turquoise dotted the sheets of precious metal. And on the solstice, he would enter the sun chamber and catch the dawn rays in a concave mirror, using it to light a fire. 7 previous Inca rulers, mummified in a high-altitude freeze-drying process, sat on a golden bench watching the ritual, waiting to be consulted on matters of state. And it may have been here where Pachacuti wrote a group of sacred hymns, still with us today.
Now, there is also the reality that these are cultural projects, which goes to show the real strength of the Incan Empire and the stability on the inside. The ability to take time to create these temples and these massive works, these massive projects, is indicative of the fact that they are not just successful militarily off on the sides, but also doing well administratively inside the empire. You can be the best soldier, the best leader on the field ever if you want to be. But if you fail to understand the administration, if you fail to understand the civic side of leadership and rule, then you fail to actually form a lasting empire. Alexander the Great, for as many incredible and strong military victories as he had, he never shores up his civic administrative side. Instead, he delegates it out to other people, and so when Alexander dies, his empire shatters into numerous other kingdoms and empires under new leadership. The Mongols, to be fair, have no interest in central administration for much of the empire. Much of the empire is ruled through basically protection money. You send us a certain amount, you have a threat, you tell us, we come and we deal with it. So, it varies. You can have a successful empire that's built on military conquest, but if you want a lasting empire, you need to focus on the administrative side just as much, if not more, than the military aspect. The Romans are a perfect example. The Romans are always at war. They're always expanding. They're always taking. But internally, the administration, the Senate, the consuls are just as important, if not arguably more important, to the success of Rome as an empire, as a long-standing one, than pretty much any of the other pieces. Now, they have to go in tandem. They cannot be done individually. When the Romans no longer have the long-term ability to fortify their border, they start to fall apart. When they stop administratively taking care of and supporting groups that they have let into the empire, they lose their loyalty and they start to turn. So this is all interconnected, and it's all important to managing a successful, organized nation.
But Pachacuti's engineering also had a dark side, because he also decided to engineer the empire's population. He forcibly moved whole ethnic groups to agricultural land he deemed more productive, displacing entire societies in order to better stock the empire's storehouses and arm its troops. Hundreds of thousands, some say millions of people from the lowest rung of Inca society were forced to resettle in far-flung corners of the burgeoning empire. And when Pachacuti died, his organs removed and his body freeze-dried in the Andean cold, his son Tupa Inca Yupanqui rested him on a golden bench alongside his ancestors and kept conquering. Though Tupa Inca would die young, this father-son team were responsible for the largest territorial expansion in Inca history. And while later emperors would put down rebellions and nibble at the edges of nearby territories, never again would the Inca experience such explosive growth. So with all that said, what was this empire they built actually like? Well, join us next time for a day in the life of several members of Inca society, from agricultural workers to the surprising social life of a dead Inca emperor. And just a hint, it totally involves mummy parties.
All right. That sounds awesome. I'm looking forward to checking that one out. Have a great day. I'll see you in the next video. Bye. Let me know what else you want to see. Tell me what else you want me to react to or check out. And have a great day. Bye.